We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
The war in Afghanistan, the Lockerbie Pan Am bombing, the European financial crisis. David Miliband, the former British Foreign Minister, has either witnessed or been part of the most controversial issues facing the political leadership in Europe and the UK today. He tried to become leader of the opposition Labour Party in his country.
I will be a candidate in that election.
And lost that election to Ed Miliband, his brother. Now, as new leaders enter the troubled arena of European politics, some say David Miliband is just waiting, anxiously, for his return. We invited him to talk to Al Jazeera to explore all this, beginning with the case of the man convicted for bombing the Pan Am jet over Lockerbie in Scotland. He died recently in Libya, almost 3 years after his release from a British jail, freedom which was won while Miliband served as Foreign Minister. Let me ask you first of all, Abdul Basit Ali al-Megrahi has died. You were UK Foreign Secretary when he was released from prison, and I do understand that this wasn't a national British decision, it was a Scottish matter. But doubts persist about whether he was the man behind the bombing. So have you ever had those doubts personally?
Well, everything I've seen says to me that he was the man behind the bombing, and of course it was gone through in court processes very carefully. But I'm not just the person who was Foreign Secretary from 2007 to 2010 when the Scottish government took their decision to release him. I'm the person who was studying as a 20-something-year-old in the US when Pan Am 103 was shot down. And when I saw the news about Mr. Megrahi, my first thoughts went back to the time when I was visiting my parents in New York and saw the carnage of Lockerbie. And I think it's those families that are at the forefront of my mind, because their torment is a daily torment over that dreadful event.
Some of the families believe he was wrongly convicted. Jim Swire, I know he's a man that you've met in the past, says he believes that Megrahi was innocent. With those doubts among people who suffered terribly because of this, wouldn't it be time to have an inquiry?
Well, I think that judicial inquiry in the court process has satisfied me, satisfied the current UK Prime Minister, satisfied former UK Prime Ministers, that we've got to know what it's possible to get to know. The court processes were exhaustive. And as I said in answer to your first question, there's nothing I've seen that casts doubt on the prevailing view about what happened during those terrible events.
Why is it prevailing when so many members of the families of Lockerbie who lost loved ones say they're not sure that he's guilty?
I think, to be fair, there are different views among the families of the deceased. What there's been is a consistent view from the court authorities, the judicial authorities, independent judicial authorities, and from UK and other governments. And obviously, if anyone has new information, that's important and that would be relevant. But I haven't seen any of that new information. No one's come forward saying there is new information. And I've seen nothing to suggest to me that the exhaustive court processes were somehow wrongly done or somehow failed to get to the heart of the matter.
Was it wrong to release him from prison?
Well, we've always said, and I've always said, that given that he lived for over 2 years after he was released, and the only grounds that the Scottish government gave for releasing him were that he was at death's door, it was obviously wrong.
Yeah, the words you used were clearly wrong. But what was it done for? Political reasons, business reasons? Because the suggestion from Bill Bramall, the Scottish minister, was that you and Gordon Brown have both given assurances to the Libyan government that you didn't want him to pass away in prison.
I think we can deal with that absolutely comprehensively. The decision was made by the Scottish government, which is run by, and was run at the time by the Scottish National Party. They were not taking any orders from anyone in London, and they've said categorically that there was no interference from Westminster, and that is the truth. And so I think we can be absolutely clear about that, because the Scottish government made their own decision. I think it's important to say, I don't cast aspersions about why they made that decision. I don't believe they made that decision for, quote unquote, you said political reasons or business reasons. I think we can be absolutely clear about that.
But a nod from the Foreign Secretary at the time and a
Well, there
British
was
Prime
absolutely
Minister
no nod.
that you don't want him to pass
No, there
away
was
in prison.
there were no
Not gonna hurt.
there were no nods and winks. The legal position was clearly set out by us, as was our responsibility. The decision was made by the SNP, Scottish National Party, Scottish Government. And as I say, it was clearly wrong, but I don't cast aspersions about their motives for doing it.
This is connected with Libya, but not with the events of 1988. Abdul Hakim Belhaj, a man who's currently suing the British Secret Service, suing one of your predecessors, Jack Straw, for the rendition, which he believes was the fault of the British government. And his lawyers have said he was sent to Diego Garcia, British Island Territory, and if you deny it, David Miliband, in 2008, you've either been deceived or you lied.
Well, I have always told all the truth that I have known about any use of Diego Garcia. And before February 2008, all the information in front of me was that it had never been used. In February 2008, I was rung up by Condoleezza Rice and told, look, new information has come to pass about 2 cases, and I reported them faithfully to Parliament at the time. And obviously, if Mr. Belhaj has new information, that needs to be looked at. So, point 1, the commitment that I have and had as Foreign Secretary to tell the truth clearly to Parliament is one that I hold absolutely dear and key. Second, and very important point, Britain has very high standards, rightly in my view, about the values that we apply in our foreign policy. And it's very important that we uphold them. One of those values is not just a revulsion against torture, it's actually a determination, not just never to be party to it or privy to it, but also to seek to stamp it out elsewhere. And we go to great length to ensure that that is the case, because it's our very strong view that not only is it morally repugnant, it actually gets in the way of the safety and security of the country.
So if people were tortured when they were flown through Diego Garcia, this is one of the suggestions. Would that be something that you were ashamed of, that at best the British government perhaps turned a blind eye or perhaps was complicit?
No, I think there's no question of the British government somehow having one policy in public and another policy in private about this. I am absolutely clear about not just my own commitment, but if you think back to 2003, the British government said from the beginning that it opposed the setting up of Guantanamo Bay. We said it didn't meet the standards that we set for judicial and other processes. That was made clear by the Prime Minister of the time, the Foreign Minister of the time, the Attorney General of the time. And when we say we believe in the process of law, we believe in due process, and we uphold the human rights that we are committed to, we mean it.
Barack Obama is saying there are hard days ahead in Afghanistan, and you've written an article fairly recently in which you talk about the fact that there's possibly no end game in sight in Afghanistan. 10 years, more than 10 years on from the first invasion. How did anybody get here?
What I said was, an end date without an end game isn't going to produce a good result. And what do I mean by an end game? I mean a political settlement in the 30,000 villages and valleys of Afghanistan, where the different ethnic groups are inside the political system, all of them are inside the political system, where Al-Qaeda is out, and the neighbors are not destabilizing the situation, whether from Pakistan all the way around to Iran on the other side, in the west of the country.
But how did the world get to this point where 10 years on, it's still as much a conundrum as ever?
I think there's been an imbalance of military over political strategy. I think that the military effort to train the Afghan National Army, which is important, has superseded or been too strong for the political effort to construct a political system that reflects the realities of Afghan life. And we know not just that Afghanistan is a very diverse country, not just that it's never been governed from the center in Kabul, but also that across the borders, the porous borders, notably to Pakistan, but also elsewhere, you need stability. And as we always say, stability in Afghanistan and stability in Pakistan, for example, go together. Those 3 things point to the fact that you need to put at the heart of your plan a political settlement, and I don't think that's been done, and I think that has been a significant part of the problem. It dates back right to 2001.
Now, matters in Europe at the moment, very difficult, possibly dangerous times. How do you balance the idea of austerity versus growth? As has been suggested by Syriza in Greece, that they'll tear up the agreement if they get into power, but they still believe that they can get growth out of that.
Well, look, what's going on in Europe is that collective austerity is being mistaken for collective prudence. It's prudent to reduce budget deficits or national debts that are of a dangerous level. It is stupid for all countries in an area to reduce their public spending at the same time when the private sector is deleveraging. And that's what's been happening in Europe over the last period. The contrast with the US is pretty striking. The US recovery isn't brilliant, but it's above 2% in significant part because the public sector, government, has said it's going to step in when the private sector lacks the confidence to invest. In a country like Britain at the moment, you've got £750 billion sitting on private sector balance sheets, but no one's investing. And they're not investing because there isn't any demand. And there isn't any demand, not just because of what's going on in our export markets, but because of our own austerity program. And I think what's happening, we're at an absolutely pivotal moment in the debate about austerity and growth. Because what I think is going to happen, triggered by the election of President Hollande in France, is that countries are going to realize that cutting your debts in and of itself is not enough to promote growth. For 2 years in the UK, but also in Germany, you've had this very strong line, cut your deficits, cut your debts, and the private sector will grow. That's not enough. We live in a more complex economy than that. And I think that Europe's challenge is actually to use the crisis that genuinely exists in the Eurozone to tackle the fundamental imbalance in the Eurozone, which is that until countries take joint liability for their debts in a single currency area, you're going to have a tendency to strife. And that's what's going on at the moment.
So is Greece being made to pay unfairly for the mistakes that have been made, perhaps collectively?
Well, Greece was desperate to get into the euro 10 years ago. And it was a source of huge national celebration and pride. And actually still 80% of Greeks want to stay in. But there's a price of staying in. At the moment, what you've seen is Greece enjoying the benefits but not bearing the burdens. But Greece on its own can't solve this problem, because anyone who's studied first-year economics knows that if you've got an imbalance between creditors and debtors, there are responsibilities on both creditors and debtors to sort it out.
But do you respect the question was, are the people of Greece being made to pay unfairly for collective mistakes, European mistakes?
No, I think the people of Greece are suffering for the decision of European leaders to create a very difficult context for them to sort out their own problems. Now, Greece is in the situation it's in because of its own national circumstances, but those circumstances have been exacerbated over the last 2 years by the context in which there's been low demand right across the Eurozone.
So perhaps the Greek people shouldn't have been put in this straitjacket in the first place?
No, I think that's definitely right. That's definitely right. But I mean, it was a political decision to put them in the first place, but we are where we are. Now, the point today is that obviously there is a chance that Greece is going to fall out of the Eurozone. What I see, though, is very strong determination to hold them in. And what I hope for is that the danger that they're going to fall out in a disorganized way forces European policymakers to take a different approach to keeping them in. Because just piling austerity on austerity is not going to solve the problem. It's almost the worst of all worlds.
When I was referring to the straitjacket, it wasn't necessarily, them becoming part of the Eurozone. It was the conditions under which they're having to repay and cut their deficit at the moment. I mean, is that something that is their fault,
well,
or something? Should this not have happened?
No, but Greece, look, the Greek problem was a pretty small problem 2 years ago. It was a €50 billion problem. That is not a big problem. It's now a €1.5 to €2 trillion problem.
So whose fault is that?
Well, that is a collective failure on the part of the Eurozone countries to nip this problem in the bud. It's evident that if you had mutualized debt through some kind of Euro bond, if you had done that 2 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in now. Now, the trick is to combine that mutualization of debt with continued responsibilities for the Greek people and the Greek government. Because Mrs. Merkel's argument is, if you just mutualize the debt, you're writing a blank check for the Greeks. So it can't just be that. It's got to be responsibilities on the debtor countries as well as on the creditor countries. But here I draw the distinction between prudence and austerity. And prudence would say Greece does need to get its debt down and there had to be some kind of haircut. Greece needs to get its deficits down, but if you simply strangle it, it'll die.
Alexis Tsipras from Syriza is a man who says we should rip up the deal. It's a criminal contract. It shouldn't ever have been done before. I'm not going to ask you about the rights or wrongs of that, but it was suggested to me that there may be similarities between the two of you in some ways, because you're young, aspiring
he's more successful than I am at the moment, I think is fair to say. Although I saw he dropped a bit in the polls recently. Look, politics matters in these countries because the economics has gone wrong. And in the end, if you don't fix the economics, the problem will surface in the politics.
But are we seeing a polarization of politics in Europe, whereas before it was perhaps centrist or slightly to the right? Now we are seeing right-wing nationalism on the rise in countries like France, and we are seeing people like Alexis Tsipras, François Hollande coming in and saying, look, this just doesn't work.
Well, I don't think you should brand people who say that collective austerity is wrong. They're not extremists. I think it's wrong to compare Monsieur Hollande, President of France, even Monsieur Tsipras, he's not yet been elected, with the National Front in France. I'm sure you didn't mean to sort of equate them, because what you've got is deep social and identity and economic issues in France. 18% vote for the National Front. We don't know what's going to be in the parliamentary elections, but nonetheless, a very pragmatic social democrat elected in Monsieur Hollande. In Greece, you've got a dissolution of the party system. And you've got new parties growing up who are saying the light at the end of the tunnel is not being brought closer by current policy. In fact, the tunnel is being lengthened. And the basic economics of that are right. You don't have to Mr. Tsipras to believe that. And I think what's absolutely key is the following question. Is it going to take a Greek exit from the euro to force a different policy approach on the countries of the eurozone? Now, I take at face value the commitment of Mrs. Merkel to try and keep the Greeks in. But the message from the G8 summit is they'll only be able to stay in if you change course.
And that's a quite realistic possibility that Greece is going to go out of the euro. And how do you then arrange for an orderly default?
Well, there are two issues, aren't there?
Because it's quite likely with the political climate and the economic climate that it's going to be anything but orderly.
Well, the danger number one is obviously a disorderly exit. Danger number two is that whatever the circumstances of the exit, the pressure then shifts to Spain and Portugal. And that's why I say if Greece drops out or is forced out, that must be the moment when extraordinary action is taken to send not just words to markets, but deeds that say we're not going to let you get Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Italy out of the euro. And we don't yet know whether the threat of Greek exit is going to force a change of course, or whether in the end it will have to be Greek exit that does it.
Britain and its relationship with Europe. You said recently Europe cannot be the alibi for the collapse of our economy, but you also said that Europe loses its balance when Britain is on the sidelines. That's a very insular view, perhaps, isn't it?
Well, no, I think it's the opposite, actually, because the British debate is about, is Europe trying to run our affairs? The current government say we should be in Europe, not run by Europe. There's this phantom of European Brussels domination. The truth is, if you talk to our fellow Europeans, they'll say, look, we want Britain in there. We know you're not in the single currency, but we don't want you on the margins when it comes to foreign policy, energy policy, even migration, single market issues. Talk to people here, I'm in the Gulf with you. They want Britain at the top table in Europe, defending the single market. And my fear about the current UK government is that partly for pressure in their own party, they've withdrawn to the margins.
Does it not suggest, though, that Britain has a bigger role to play than perhaps it does? When you say Europe loses its balance with Britain on the sidelines, it suggests that Britain is perhaps the counterweight to everything else in Europe.
Well, I think that if you talk to French and Germans, but also Swedes and Poles, they will say to you, Europe is a better balanced aeroplane when Britain is working at the heart of it. That's partly because of Britain's global links. It's partly because of our obsession with following rules that when they're made, we do it on the basis they're definitely going to be followed. So we're very pernickety about that. We defend the single market, the 27, which is patrolled by the European Commission. I mean, it is ironic that a very Eurosceptic Prime Minister, David Cameron, is appealing to the European Commission, the quote-unquote unelected Brussels bureaucracy, to defend the single market. But he's right to do so. That's their role. So I would say that every country in the world has to secure its own neighbourhood. For Britain, that means being completely engaged with the future of the European continent. That's not at the expense of our global links, Because if you're in the Gulf, if you're in Washington, if you're in Beijing, they will say to you, look, sure, we want a bilateral relationship with Britain. We want to come to the Olympics, we want to be part of, we like your culture, but we want more than that. We want Britain to be an influential voice in the multilateral councils that matter around the world, and that's where we should be.
And at the heart of Europe, I seem to hear you suggesting.
To coin a phrase.
So would it be in your interest, your party's interest, Britain's interest, to have a referendum with the British people on getting out of Europe?
Well,
which is what John Cruddas, who supported you in the leadership election, now works for the leader of the opposition, your brother, suggests should happen.
Well, no one's proposing a referendum on European membership at the moment.
Well, he is. John Cruddas is.
It's a difficult enough job for Ed to be leader of the opposition without me running commentary on the issues.
So
like
what
this.
do you think of John Cruddas' suggestion that there should be a referendum?
No, to be fair to John, what he was pointing to was a longer-term issue to do with how Britain and the British people are engaged with the European Union. Now, my own view is that at the moment, and we had a vote in the House of Commons about this recently, everybody will tell you in Britain, the big issue for us at the moment is to do with jobs and the future of the health service, the future of our economy. And I think that's where the focus is. I'm not going to get into the medium-term debate about a referendum or other things on the future of Britain in the European Union. What I want to see is Britain engaged in the European Union.
The fact that John Cruddas is working now for your brother, has been brought into the central team, does that suggest a return to old Labour values?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that everybody knows that politics has to move forward, not back. And there's no future for any political party in trying to recreate the past. And whether on the front bench, as we call it in the House of Commons, which is where John Cruddas is, or on the front line, which is where I am, at local level trying to support the Labour Party, we've got to be about solving tomorrow's problems, not yesterday's problems.
Yeah, but it does suggest, according to a lot of commentators, that the party is moving away from the old Blairite centralised centre system, and actually going further back towards trade unionists and block votes, and not necessarily the block vote, but actually moving to the left side.
I mean, I've been around long enough. I actually worked with John Cruddas for Tony Blair. So these things go round in weird and wonderful circles. What matters is what leaders of parties say and do. And I'm sure that Labour understands, and the leadership understands, that you've got to be a party of the future to be a party that wins. And you're proud of your achievements, you're humble about the things you got wrong, but you're focused on the future.
It's been very interesting, David, listening to you refer a couple of times during the course of this interview to the fact that your career is not actually at its height at the moment because you're no longer in frontline politics. You work in
I'm in front line, but not front bench,
okay,
I think is the line.
I want to read you something that was in the Daily Mirror. It says, looking at you these days is like watching a champion racehorse reduced to giving seaside rides.
Oh, that's a bit cruel. I don't know who wrote that. I mean, look, it's a different situation when you're in opposition rather than in government, and it's a different situation when you're trying to make change at local level than when you're on the front bench in the House of Commons.
I know what you're trying to say, but go back to this. I mean, it effectively means that you've been put out to grass, that you're no longer doing what you're best at.
Well, I lost an election, a leadership election for my party. I think it's right that Ed has the space to lead the party as he sees fit. I don't want to be in a situation where every time I come on these programs, people are saying, but we saw you say this and he said that, and what's the Kremlinology about different...
No, but what's in your heart? Do you feel like you're
in
not...
my heart is I passionately want to see the election of a Labour government, and I think the best way I can do that at the moment, support that at the moment, is by helping to support the Labour Party at grassroots level and working on the ideas that in the end are going to bear fruit and hopefully help Labour into government.
There's just been a shadow cabinet reshuffle. You weren't brought in. I want to ask you, did you talk to your brother, leader of the Labour Party,
of course I talked to my mother.
Whether you would come back?
Of course I talked to my brother, and of course I'm not going to tell you what he and I talk about.
Well, were you offered the job as Foreign Secretary? Shadow Foreign Secretary?
I'm certainly not going to talk about it, but the answer to that one actually is no. So we're not spending our time trading off jobs. So we're not going to let, the way, what's the old expression, that the rumour gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on, so let's not let that rumour get going. I've been absolutely clear that now is not the time for me to be on the front bench in Parliament. I'm trying to support the Labour Party at local level. I'm trying to make sure that Ed has the space to lead the Labour Party as he sees fit, and I think that's the right thing to do.
Another commentator also said perhaps that if your brother doesn't win the next election as leader of the Labour Party...
I want him to win.
No, let me finish, please. If he doesn't win it, then the Labour Party may have had enough of Miliband's, and that you may have lost the chance ever to become Prime Minister.
Maybe they're right, I don't know. I mean, you just don't know, do you? That's the whole point about life, that the future is unwritten. And what you've got to do is act in the present with integrity and with purpose, and that's what I'm trying to do.
David Miliband, thanks very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.